This month, Doctor Strange has been casting a spell on the box office, but which characters in the MCU have the best character arcs? Today, I'm going to give you my picks for the top 10 best character arcs in the MCU. So let's talk about it. Before we get started, be sure to join me down below in the comment section. Share your picks for the characters with the best character arcs. The ones who have grown, changed, and developed in the most compelling and consistent way throughout their time in the MCU. One more thing before we get started. This video is brought to you by Factor. Factor makes meeting your nutrition goals easier than ever by delivering fresh, never frozen, dietitian-approved meals right to your doorstep. When I'm not talking movies too much or hanging out with my family, I'm actually really into fitness. In fact, right next to where I'm filming is an exercise bike, and in the corner are some weights. But the other side of fitness is your diet. Factor makes it super easy to meet my daily goals through nutritious and purposeful eating. Factor offers keto, calorie smart, chef's choice, and vegan plus veggie options, which include seafood, meat, and plant-based meals. There's no prep and there's no mess. They send to you pre-prepared meals that are ready to eat in just a few minutes. I went with the keto plan because I'm a high protein, low carb kind of guy, but it was great for me because it added variety into my diet while hitting that sweet spot of tasting good, meeting my nutrition goals, and being extremely convenient. A couple months back, I worked with HelloFresh. Factor is actually owned now by HelloFresh. And that means there's a wider array of meal plans to choose from. There's something to fit everyone's tastes and goals. Head to go.factor75.com/SeanChandler120 and use code SeanChandler120 to get $120 off your order.
No way!
And let's get started. Number 10, Black Widow. Now, she was first introduced in Iron Man 2 as just a side character with very little backstory and development. And then in Avengers, they give her a little bit more, but in very subtle ways, through dialogue with Clint, through things that Loki says to her.
And what are you now?
I got red in my ledger. I'd like to wipe it out.
Your ledger is dripping. It's gushing red, and you think saving a man no more virtuous than yourself will change anything?
They just hinted at who she used to be and this redemptive arc that she's been on. And with each new appearance, we got to know a little bit more about the ways that she was controlled, manipulated, abused. And then finally, even after her character's death, we learn about the fake family that she had, what it meant to her, and that kind of informed our understanding of the family that she found with the Avengers. And so it was a very different sort of character arc, and not one that kind of followed the traditional hero's journey where you see someone before and then you follow them as they go through the transformation. We see her fairly late in her transformation and learn about it later on in her stories. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that they didn't develop the character and take her on a journey. Now, I do think that one of the things that holds her back from being higher up on this list is it did kind of keep repeating this idea that she's trying to make up for all the blood in her ledger, but still a compelling, interesting journey for the character. Number 9, Wenwu, the real Mandarin. With just one real appearance in the MCU, they were able to tell a very compelling, complex journey with his character. For hundreds of years, he was this dominant, aggressive dictator that was transformed by love, calmed down, and decided to have a family. And then eventually his past caught up with him, and it cost him his wife that pushed him back to being the worst version of himself. And then eventually when he gets this idea of hope that maybe there's a way to bring back his wife that brought out the best of him, he becomes delusional and goes on this course to try and bring her back. And he's tempted by the darkness, by that one thing that he wishes that he could have, even though it's so clearly not true. And it takes him down this dark path that puts him up against his children, that causes his ultimate demise. But his journey has so many twists and turns in just this one film that we have, because he's a complex person that does grow and change based on the people around him, and when he gives into his own worst tendencies, you see the consequences of it. Number 8, Bucky the Winter Soldier and Steve Rogers' best friend. Now, this is a character that's introduced as basically Steve's defender, that's his great friend when Steve was a nobody. Bucky was the guy that would get Steve out of trouble. And then he became a war hero in his own right. And when Captain America emerged, he joined that team with him and then died in battle and was turned into a weapon by Zola and Hydra, and thus became the ultimate weapon of the people that he was fighting against, and for decades was used to do horrible, evil things as this assassin. And eventually when Steve emerges again, he's able to kind of snap his friend out of it and bring his humanity out that takes him on this journey of rediscovering himself. But even though he's not responsible for his long history, he still carries the weight of the fact that he killed Tony Stark's parents. And that is a big reason why the Avengers broke up. He carries the guilt over that. And so you also have someone that's trying to make amends for something that he didn't really choose to do, which just makes for a very interesting journey for someone to be on, that he's a very decent guy that's done horrible things and just wants to do the right thing. Next up, Hawkeye. Now, this is an interesting one because he doesn't have much of an arc in his first few appearances in the MCU. When he shows up in Thor, he's just kind of there. Then in Avengers, he's on the wrong side because he's being mind controlled. The big reveal in Age of Ultron is that he has a family.
The city's flying. We're fighting an army of robots, and I have a bow and arrow. None of this makes sense.
But he doesn't have much of an arc in there. It's not really until Endgame where his story starts getting very interesting, because he lost his entire family in Thanos' snap, and thus he went out with a vengeance, turned into a vigilante, and spent years killing people. This guy that was a hero, that upheld the law, that took down the bad guys in his own way, became a very bad guy in what he was doing, and the way that he channeled his rage and his skills for years, because he was so broken over what he lost. And then when Endgame rolls around and there's hope to save the day, he's on this journey to where he's trying to make things right. But he doesn't even think he deserves to live. And so you have a moment where he's fighting to die with Black Widow because he doesn't think he deserves to live anymore. And she knows better that he actually has something to live for because he has a family that can be brought back. And there's something very compelling about watching a very broken hero fall very far from grace and be on a path of redemption. And then in the Hawkeye show, you see him having to make amends for that. That it comes around, that there's a cost to what he did. Personally, it took a toll on others. That's coming back around to him, and it just kind of resolved that story in a bunch of different ways. And so I just think they've given him a great arc pretty late in his time in the MCU. Number 6, Loki. Now, this is a fun character because sometimes he's one of the best villains. Sometimes he's teaming up with Thor as a hero. Other times he's an anti-hero. Other times he's not really on a side. He's just on kind of these adventures, but always he's growing and changing, and we're slowly learning a little bit more about what makes him tick. Causing so much of this conflict within him is that he's this orphan torn between worlds with great ambitions, loyalties to his family, but competition with them at the same time. He's just a person with very deep psychological and family wounds that drive him to all sorts of interesting and extreme places. But a big part of what makes his journey so compelling is that we get two. That we see the redemptive journey that kind of takes place in Thor the Dark World, and then even more so in Ragnarok, and then ultimately in his choice to try and go after Thanos in Infinity War, where he ultimately dies. But then because of what they do with time travel and the multiverse, we then see this kind of reverted back version to Avengers 2012 Loki going on the adventure in the TV show, where once again we dive into the psychology of this character and watch him kind of unpack and deconstruct all of his thinking and realize what's kind of been going on, and that at the end of the day, he might be horribly misguided at times, but in another sense, there is a goodness inside of him. In fifth place, Spider-Man. In a number of ways, this is one of the trickiest characters on this list because in the previous 20 years, there were 2 other versions of the character, so they had to find a way to have a compelling character arc that just didn't rehash everything that had been done before with Tobey and Andrew, and they found a way to cleverly tell his origin story in his 3rd movie in a totally unexpected time, in a subversive manner where you don't realize that going into the movie. And by the end of it, they've given him this amazing arc where he learns that lesson: with great power comes great responsibility. What they did with No Way Home, I think, dramatically elevated Tom Holland's Spider-Man from just being a really fun addition to the MCU to being one of the great character arcs in the MCU. And we haven't even talked about the fact that he spent 5 years dusted in space. So just a really interesting version of the character that was clever in how it did all the classic Spider-Man stuff, but in an entirely new way. In 4th place is Doctor Strange, and every single time he shows up in the MCU, I love this character even more. Now, they introduced him as this arrogant doctor that's just obsessed with his own prestige. All he cares about is getting his hands back so he can get back to being the best surgeon in the world. And by the end of the film, they've taken him from an insufferable douchebag to a sufferable douchebag. And then throughout his additional adventures, they've really explored the different Doctor Stranges. And that's what's been fun with his arc, is that we've learned more about our Doctor Strange by seeing the other Doctor Stranges. I loved the episodes of Doctor Strange in What If, where you really realize how much Christine means to him, but also you see how our Doctor Strange is growing and changing, getting a little bit of humility. And then has this lingering choice that he made that affected the entire universe, that he decided he knew the one way that you could beat Thanos. He decided that unilaterally, and that carries that weight. And then by seeing the choices that other Doctor Stranges made that are very similar to that, realized there's so much arrogance to what I've been doing. And it brings him down just a little bit. While he's still awesome, he's still cocky, but he's grown and he's changed. So I love what they've been doing with Doctor Strange. Real quick, before I give you my top 3, remember to join me down below in the comments section. Share your favorite character arcs in the MCU. Not your favorite characters. The characters who have grown and changed in the most compelling and consistent manner. And I know there's some heavy hitters in the MCU that I didn't include in this list. That's because I felt they didn't grow and change enough. These 10 are the ones that I think had the most compelling, consistent changes. Also, if you enjoyed this video, I've done a ton of other MCU related videos, rankings, top 10s, all that fun stuff. You can check them all out in this playlist right up here when this video is over. In 3rd place, Steve Rogers. Now, because he starts at the beginning of Captain America: The First Avenger, a decent good guy that wants to do the right thing and go fight Nazis, he doesn't have as obvious of an arc as some other people on this list because he doesn't have obvious faults that he's having to overcome. That's actually what makes his so interesting and unique on this list, because he's introduced as someone that just wants to go to war. And then he spends all this time as a soldier, and then he gets frozen, woken up, and all he knows is the next mission. And whether that's joining the Avengers, what he does in Captain America the Winter Soldier. It's just always about the mission, the job, the next bad guy to fight. And he never is able to pause to have a personal life, to be Steve Rogers, not Captain America, to have that dance with Peggy that's always been pushed aside. And likewise, because he was born in a more simpler time, where it was real obvious Nazis bad, and then he emerges in the present time that's much more complex of who's good, who's bad. Wait, the government's corrupt. This isn't. You show him also transform as he kind of realizes that these authority figures and structures that I thought were supposed to be the good guys, sometimes they're not. And so he's the one that's like, no, I'm not going to sign the Sokovia Accords because these are some corrupt governmental systems and structures. And so you see his worldview changing, as well as by the time you get to the end of Endgame, and he's literally saved half the universe. And he decides, all right, I need to pause, spend some time being Steve Rogers. I thought that was just a real beautiful journey to take him on. Our runner-up, Wanda the Scarlet Witch. One of the greatest Avengers and one of the greatest villains in the entire MCU. And that's what makes her so compelling, is that at her core, she's not really trying to be a hero. She's not really trying to be a villain. She's just someone that has had this tragic life that just keeps pulling her into this world that she doesn't really want to be a part of. So from an early age, her family was killed. Then she was experimented on. Then when she finally decides to be a hero, her brother dies. Then in the Avengers, she finds a new family with Vision, and then she has to kill him to try and save the universe.
I can't feel you.
Every time she thinks that she's found a new family, and that's all that she wants, it's taken from her.
You took everything from me.
I don't even know who you are.
You will.
And then in the trauma of that, in the brokenness, and in her own lack of control of her own power, she accidentally takes a city hostage to give herself the fantasy life that she wants, where she has Vision and she has kids. But that solution only adds to the problem, because to do that, she has to take people captive, and that's a bad thing. She's inadvertently made herself a villain, and she's put a lie in her head that she has kids. She's teased herself in a way, tempted herself with something that's not real. So when that fantasy dies, now the wound in her heart is even bigger, that drives her to an even darker place where she goes and gets the Darkhold to try and find some way to ease the pain of loss. And once again gives in to try and find her kids. Her desire for family, that's a good thing. It's not a nefarious goal to want a family, to love and to be loved. But she doesn't have control of her powers, and she gives into temptation and goes to very dark places to try and obtain a good thing. And eventually the Darkhold gets a hold of her, and all she sees is red and delusion and lies, and it turns her into a monster. It turns her into this horrible villain. And that's the tragedy of the Scarlet Witch. She doesn't want to be a villain. She just wants a family and to be loved, but she's so broken that she keeps going to the wrong place. But in first place, I've got to go with Tony Stark. This is a classic hero's journey, and they kept finding new ways to add layers to his character. All right in his original film, because it doesn't have the weight of the rest of the MCU, they're able to make it more character focused, where you see him as this narcissist that's just living for himself, living for profits, being the rock star that doesn't care what's going on with his company. And then in true hero's journey fashion, he goes into a literal cave where he's transformed, sees the error of his ways, and emerges different when he returns back home. And there's so many lines of dialogue in that film that have so much richer meaning when you know the rest of his story. After you've seen Endgame, Iron Man 1 is an even more fulfilling film because they delivered on the promise of the dialogue in that film.
You're gonna kill yourself, Tony. I'm not gonna be a part of it.
I shouldn't be alive unless it was for a reason. I just finally know what I have to do.
Throughout the course of his time in the MCU, he becomes a father figure to Peter Parker. He's introduced as a womanizer, but then when you get to Endgame, the reason he's nervous about joining back into the fight and trying to undo what happened is that he doesn't want to lose his family. That becomes the thing that he cares about the most. But also what sparks him to go into action is how much he did care about Peter Parker and realizing he could get him back. And there's just something so profound about that journey that they took him on, and the way that they were able to give him his peace and his rest, his 5 years where the apocalypse gave him his dream life for 5 years. He did get that payoff at the end of his life, but also he was that transformed hero that would sacrifice himself to undo the apocalypse and bring so many people back. And that is just such a compelling arc that paid off so well. So for me, I think easily, without question, coming in at number 1 is Tony Stark. Remember, if you're interested in convenient, delicious, fresh meals delivered to your house that meet your nutrition goals, head to go.factor75.com/SeanChandler120 and use promo code SeanChandler120 to save $120 off your order. Thank you so much for watching, and keep talking movies to me.